And thank you all for coming to this meeting. I'll just briefly outline what I'm going to be talking about, what the purpose of this talk is, which will last around about an hour. What I'm going to do is, as well as talk about moth recording per se, is actually go through a few things to do with moth. So first of all, I'm going to define a moth and try and put it in the context of moths and butterflies. And then I'm just going to spend a few minutes looking at moth names, because anyone who's come across English moth names will know that there are an interesting bunch of phrases and names. Then going to look at variation or the lack thereof in moths. Look at some sources of information that might be helpful to you in moth recording or just learning a bit more about moths. Then we'll look at all the various methods to record moths, going from the very simple to the more technical. But this is not meant to be a technical talk, it is meant to be a general talk. So there won't be a vast amount of detail on some of the more technical aspects, but I'm very happy to answer any questions about those, either online at the end of this meeting or offline. And then we'll just have some more general topical information about various things that I think are interesting about moths, particularly in relation to our area. And all the way through, I'm hoping that even if what I'm saying doesn't sound what you want to hear, we'll actually have a whole load of images of moths, which I hope at least you'll find attractive, if nothing else. So here we go. I should say, by the way, that the moth on the front screen, most of the moths are identified in captions in case the sound goes a bit weird and wonderful. But this one isn't on the screen here. This is a large emerald, which is one of our very large green moths, which occurs mainly in woodland, occasionally comes to gardens and so on. And that's sitting on our front garden wall. Right. So what is a moth? Let's really start from the basics. I mean, basically, moth is the same as a butterfly, or a butterfly is the same as a moth. You ask a moth person, and they will say that butterflies are just a small group of moths. But let's go through the life cycle. So you start off with some eggs, and they go on to a larva or a caterpillar. And you see all these are captions, so I won't identify them all in speech. And then that goes on to form a pupa or a chrysalis. Most moths, or many moths, form their chrysalises out of the way, either underground or hidden away inside bark and things like that. But the burnet moths actually have their pupae sitting on grass stems or plant stems in fields. They're very easy to find.
Andrew, sorry, can I just, one or two people are saying they're having trouble hearing. I don't know whether you could sit any closer to your microphone.
Yeah, how's that?
Yeah, that's definitely louder.
Sorry about that, folks. And then we go on, and obviously we have the adult moth. So that's the life cycle, just the same as a butterfly, but considerable variation in form and so on. So let's have a look at what butterfly versus moth. One of the questions I've often asked, well, what's the difference between a butterfly and a moth? And the answer I tend to give is, as you will see, that basically the difference is the spelling of the two words. There isn't any real biological difference. In a lot of books, people will try and define what the difference is, and they'll say, well, butterflies have clubbed antennae, moths have feathery antennae or antennae of a different shape. But for every pattern that's identified, there is something that breaks it in the moth world. So the burnet moth, the day-flying burnet moth, also have clubbed antennae like butterflies. And some people say, well, it's to do with the way they rest. The butterflies rest with their wings held up above their backs vertically. Moths hold them horizontally, as you can see there. But then there are some exceptions there, such as the early thorn, which always sits with its wings completely closed, just like a butterfly might. And then, of course, the classic butterflies fly in the day, moths fly at night. Well, yes, they do to a great extent, but there are well over 100, a couple of hundred day-flying moths. And by that, I don't mean things that can be disturbed. I mean things that naturally fly in the sunshine, just like a butterfly would. So before we just go on to the difference between macros and micros, which is another distinction, I just want to give you a few numbers just to give you an idea of the difference. The current total for both butterflies and moths in this country on the British list is 2,558 species, of which 58 are now considered to be extinct. Plus there's another 191 which are called adventives, which means they've been imported accidentally into this country. So they've been found on ships or on planes and so on, and that actually got into the wild. Of those, butterflies, 77 on the British list, of which 5 are considered extinct and 27 are adventive. So you can see that butterflies really are a very small subset of moths, a very small group of moths, if you like. So let's move on to another distinction within the moth world itself, and that is macros and micros. And here we have one of our largest native moths, the privet hawk moth, and you see I've rather crudely drawn some dimensions onto the photo. And then up in the top right-hand corner, there is Teleiodes vulgella, which is a very small but quite common moth. And you can see the difference in size, and that's what distinguishes macro moths and micro moths. However, and just an example there of them in the real world, so that's a red underwing sitting on my hand, and then down below it are some Micropteryx palfella. You can see you could fit dozens of those onto one buttercup flower, which itself is much smaller than the underwing moth up the top. But there are exceptions to this. There are some micro moths which are actually quite large. Many of you will be familiar with the box tree moth now, from it either seeing it in the day or even seeing its caterpillars eating your box trees. That is a micro moth, even though it is bigger than many macro moths, some of which are actually quite small, and it's easy to get some of the two groups mixed up. So basically, macro moths are mainly certain families which are large. Micro moths are mainly some families which are small. It's a useful distinction, but like so many things in moth recording, it's not definitive. So I thought, as I mentioned, we'd have a look at some English names, because many of the names moth groups actually go back to when people first started studying and trying to define species, and that's really from the 18th century onwards. So you've got to put yourself into the mindset of probably a gentleman, a vicar, clergyman, an academic, might all be the same person, naming moths after what they remember and know from their time. So we've got the footman, which is meant to stand up straight like this and look like a footman attending a nobleman. And then we have the darts. Okay, so you can see on these ones there is a dart, a kind of dart marking. And this is darts, more like the dart in a piece of clothing to open out two pieces of cloth being joined together, rather than the darts that you throw to get 180. Then we got the rustics, sort of thing, the very drab, plain, rustic clothing that someone in a peasant or someone working in the rural area would wear. And we've got the Quakers, traditionally very ascetic, somewhat dowdy people following undemonstrative religion, so that they are similarly dull brown and grey moths. Then we have the carpets. A lot of people, when I mention carpet moths, think, oh, these are the ones that eat your carpet. They're not. They all live outside. None of them are the least bit interested in your carpet, but the markings are thought to be like something along the lines of an Axminster or Wilton carpet pattern. And then we have the pugs, which are mainly very small moths. Well, in fact, the whole group are very small moths, like a pug dog, for instance. And then we have the waves, which have lots of these wavy line patterns over the wings, which again illustrate quite clearly why they're called what they are. So it's quite interesting to put, you can go back 200 or 300 years to understand why some of our groups of moths have their particularly perhaps unusual sounding names. Now, some moths are very obviously named. This one is the satellite, and if you look on the wings, you can see that you've got the big white planet with a little white, or even a couple of white dots either side. like satellites, as in moons orbiting a planet. Then this one is called the shark, and you can see it's got the big dorsal fin sticking up at the top. And this one is the rosy footman, and because the colour gives it away, even if the shape isn't quite the same as some of the other footmen. And this one, which you really need to look at head on to see what it is, but when you see that it's called the spectacle, I think the name speaks for itself. And down here we've got Yummy Yummy, the chocolate tip. Again, as all these are self-explanatory. This one is called the blood vein. This one is the yellow shell. So sort of shell-like pattern, rather like a scallop shell. And the colour's obvious. And this one is a blotched emerald. You saw the large emerald early on. So this one, the pattern is broken up with some creamy white patches, hence blotched emerald. So but there's a few, you think, why are they called that? So this is called the drinker. So why is it called the drinker? It's not a moth that you see in pubs a lot or anything like that. It's actually named from its caterpillar, which I haven't actually got it doing, a picture of it doing what it's meant to be doing, but they actually will sit on leaves. You often see them when they're fully grown, sitting on leaves of sedge or grass, sipping dewdrops in the morning, hence the name drinker. And then this is the nut tree tussock. So why is that called the nut tree tussock? Because again, of its caterpillar, because it's covered in tussocks of hair, and they do eat nut trees, like hazel, for instance. And then we've got a small group of moths called loopers in the terms of the English name. This is the Rannoch looper, named after a place in Scotland. But a whole group of these moths are also called loopers, and that's a looper caterpillar. And you can see straight away that the caterpillar spends a lot of time looping along, and this is a very extremely looped caterpillar of a related species, not actually a Rannoch looper caterpillar. Now, can you get moths confused with anything else? Well, yes. Caddis flies are the nearest looking creatures. They vary from, there are micro and macro caddis flies. So a couple of things that help you to tell them apart. One is that the wings look much rougher because rather than being covered in scales, they're covered in hairs, and they tend to have antennae that point forward, whereas many moths, but not all, have their antennae pointing across or folded back along the body. But when you moth trap, you'll often find a lot of caddis flies will be attracted to a moth trap. And then we have larvae or caterpillars and sawflies, which look nothing like moths when they're adult, actually have caterpillars which look very like moth caterpillars. There's just a couple of things that you can distinguish them. At the back of the body, I don't know if you can see, if I put there are a whole load of what are called prolegs, pairs and pairs of them. They're like the suckers that help the creature to hold on to the bark. And there are many more of those than there will ever be on a moth caterpillar. I also tend to have a very big simple eye on the head, but they're very caterpillar-like. And then the various day-flying insects like scorpion flies, which, especially if you see them moving at first sight, have got the sort of broad wings of a moth. And then you have a hoverfly larva, which almost looks like a caterpillar enclosed in jelly. Rather strange creatures when you see them moving around on leaves. But there are various other things that can be confused with moths, particularly caddis flies, it has to be said. So, which species? Now, this is one of the problems with moth recording, and there are several groups of species which are almost or are impossible to tell apart as adults. These are ermine moths, and the reason I put question mark ermine is because there are about 4 or 5 species which all look very similar, have similar markings or variable markings, and they're almost impossible to tell apart. Well, they are impossible to tell apart as adults. There have to be, if you really wanted to know what was going on, you'd have to dissect them. And I'm not going to talk about dissection at all tonight, apart from that. This moth, is it a grey dagger or a dark dagger? You can't tell. They look exactly the same. The caterpillar, we know they're a different species because the caterpillars look very different. but the adults look identical. And there are a whole load of white crows which look very similar. This could be a Claris notana, it could be a Claris variegana, I have no idea. They both have lots of different forms, but both species share all the same colour forms. Then we have the common rustic, or is it a lesser common rustic? The same applies to those. There have been various people who put forward theories that you can tell in certain ways, but really, if you're someone accepting moth records, you would only accept this as the aggregate of the common or the lesser common rustic. And then we have the dark barred twin spot carpet, or is it a red barred twin spot carpet? A lot of red barred twin spot carpets are quite obviously red, but when you get a darker form like this, you can't really tell the difference. And then we have this, which is a copper underwing, or is it Svensson's copper underwing? You have to actually look at the underside of the underwing to see how the copper colour, which you can't see on this picture, actually spreads across the wing, which is quite fiddly to open its wings up without it wiggling and squiggling in your hand. It can be done. So there are some confusion species, unfortunately. But then we have the opposite. We have species with the same species, but variation. These are both the ash bud moth. After a while, you get to recognize these, like in birds, moths have a certain species have a certain jizz about them, and you get to realize, though you may be surprised each year when you first come across things, that these two moths are the same but different. And then we have things like the brimstone. The common form is the yellow form at the top, but very, very rarely, once in my lifetime of catching moths over 30 years, you get a kind of, well, it's not albino because it's got colour on it, but you get a white version of it. It's the only one I've ever caught, and unfortunately photographed against a white background, which is not brilliant. But it's interesting, the variation that can occur. And then we have things like the scalloped oak. The one on the left is the normal scalloped oak, which, I don't know, 999 out of 1,000 will look like that. But just occasionally, you get a melanic version where the wing pattern is completely different, or the wing colour, I should say, is completely different. The pattern's much the same, but very striking. And if you can happen to get two together to photograph, it makes quite a striking photo. And then this is the moth beloved of biology textbooks and evolutionists, the peppered moth, which exists in the typical form at the top, which is most of what you see now with the black and white markings, the pepper markings. But then we have the melanic version, which is pretty well all over brown, which was thought, I mean, there's all sorts of books been written about this and papers, thought to have developed during the Industrial Revolution when there was a lot more pollution on leaves and walls and so on. And there's still a few of them around that can retain the gene which creates this very dark form. So you've got species lookalikes, and you've got within the same species unlookalikes. So let's have a look at some places where you can go to find out a bit more information about moths. So I've got three, what I consider, for our area, the three websites that would be your go-tos, and hopefully these will open up in a browser. The first one is a national site, UK Moths, and this is it on the web here. And this is the best resource for information about UK moths. Obviously, you can see that there's all sorts of links on there. But the most useful thing is that there's a whole systematic list of moths, and you can click on any particular moth, and it will go to a picture as one of those ermines that I mentioned, give you some information about it, and you can look at other pictures as well. So that's a very useful website. It's been going for years, and highly recommended. And then let's go more local. We've got, this is the Hertfordshire Middlesex Moth Group that Malcolm mentioned. There's information about us as a group on this page, and you can see various publications that are available. There's books and listings and Colin Plant, who's the moth recorder, produces a fairly regular newsletter which is sent out to people if they want it, but is also available. The last 6 issues or so are available on here, and it's got mine and his contact details on. And if we go back to the moth guide, you can choose a species by name, and up it comes with photo, distribution map, some information, and a flight graph. Or if you don't know the name or you want to search for something broader, you can put in our old friends the Quakers, and it will bring up pictures of all and information about all the Quaker species of moths which are found in Hertfordshire and Middlesex. So not surprisingly, I recommend that site. And then we have Herts Moth Group, Herts and Middlesex Moth Group, I should say. We also have a Facebook page, which is pretty active. A lot of observations and records, photographs are put on there. Various people. You see Liz has put something up there, for instance. This is a private group, so you have to apply to join it to actually post. So you can, if you've got a Facebook login, you can read it without joining, and I recommend that for keeping an eye on what's going on at any particular time. And as well as that, I want to recommend a few print publications, because however good the web is, there's still definitely a market and a need for print publication you can sit at and look at your leisure. Or it's much easier to flick through lots of pictures in a short time, I think, in print than it is on the web. So at the top there, Chris Manley's British Moths. There's going to be a 3rd edition coming out in the summer. Lots of colour photos of every single British moth, highly recommended, with very brief descriptions. And then the 3 Bloomsbury wildlife guides, one on micros, one on macro moths, and recent one on caterpillars. If you're familiar, as I expect many of you are, with Richard Lewington's superlative art of butterflies, he does the same for moths. And in some cases, paintings that actually give you a better idea of the moth than photographs. There's less distraction, and they're all highly recommended. They all come in at round about 30 to 40 pounds. So that, you know, they're not cheap, but they're a very worthwhile investment. And then if you can't stretch to that, but you want some basic references, the 3 field studies guides at the bottom there are obviously much more limited in that they covered caterpillars. Sorry, that's butterfly caterpillars. I don't know how that one got in there. Day flying moths and hawk moths, and they're highly recommended, and they're about £3 each, £3.50 each. But they are the guides I'd recommend above any others. So that's gone through the basics. We'll now look at ways that you can record moths without too much effort to begin with. So as I mentioned earlier, we've got a lot of day flying moths. And so we have the cinnabar moth, which you can see flapping gently around the landscape, often during the day, especially if there's any ragwort around, and much more rare and restricted to 1 or 2 sites in Hertfordshire, but quite common in bits of northeast Middlesex, particularly in Barnet and Enfield, places like Trent Park, Monk and Hadley Common. This is a moth which flies exclusively during the day, doesn't sit still for very long. It's quite difficult to photograph, but all black, just the white tip to the wings. But we have quite good colonies of that. The speckled yellow, which again found not widely distributed, find it in woodland where wood sage grows, very attractive little moth, and it has the same habits as a chimney sweeper, rarely stays still for very long. In grassland, you'll frequently come across the burnet companion, which is so butterfly-like. It's often confused for things like dingy skipper when people report them. And then in high summer, many of you will be familiar with the burnet moths, which are exclusively day flying. This is a 6-spot burnet, and visit flowers and feed just like butterflies do. Then we've got the latticed heath, which is again very butterfly-like and responsible for some reports out of areas of grizzled skipper, I suspect. Similar kind of size, as is the mother Shipton. Now, the Mother Shipton is one that's got an interesting name. If you're familiar with Mother Shipton's cave and the legend of Mother Shipton in Yorkshire, who was meant to be this rather hag-like old witch, this is called Mother Shipton because of the face running down from the top of the wing with the big hook nose and big mouth and eye, and that's meant to look like Mother Shipton. And then we have the other common burnet moth, the narrow-bordered 5-spot burnet, which you can see has 5 spots on the wing compared to the 6-spot burnet, which has 6 spots. So just to show how many day-flying moths we actually do have, here's another page of them. Pyrauston nigrata is often found on chalk grassland. The silver white actually flies any old time of the day, it's not bothered. It's a migrant moth, very, very common. Find it in gardens, sitting on grassland, easily disturbed. The emperor moth, which is the only silk moth family moth that lives in Britain, that's a male, and they are big and they are quite spectacular, though you rarely see them sitting down, but we'll see some other emperor moths in action in a little while. One that many people would be familiar with now, the Jersey tiger. 5 years ago, we would have been talking about it for our area. Now it's a very common moth, certainly in London and in East Hertfordshire. It's gradually spreading further north and west. The grass rivulet, which is quite a rare moth, associated with a yellow rattle, so found in grassland again, especially where grassland has been planted and yellow rattle has been planted, which is who's a parasite on grass roots to try and keep rank grasses down, and the grass rivulet will often follow it there. And then one of my favourite, if you're into heavy rock, Nemophora metallica, which spends its time feeding on and sitting on scabious principally, often in chalk areas, but that's again is an expanding moth. It's one of the longhorns, which we'll see again some more of those, with antennae, as you can see, which are much longer than the body. And then, as well as day flyers, there are some which are quite easy to find by day that don't tend to hide away, even though they're night flyers. This is a very common plume moth called Emelina monodactyla, which you can often find sitting on walls and fences and leaves, and that's a mating pair. The yellow shell, which we met earlier, and the dusky sallow, which tends to roost in full view of everyone. It's a night flying moth, but it roosts on top of scabious flowers, beg your pardon, on top of knapweed flowers. The silver ground carpet, if you brush along through long grass or near nettles, the chances are that you'll disturb one of these during the spring and early summer. Green carpet, which again flies through most of the year and is very easily disturbed. They often don't look green, they often look a whitish colour because green in most moths fades very quickly from the fresh bright green to a rather washed out just about green. And the ear moth, which is mainly a night fly but will occasionally be found, as this one was, amongst about 40 of them feeding on ragwort. This was on in Hamworth Park in southwest London. And so some night fly moths will come and nectar on very hot days. So have a look at some caterpillars that you might come across. Many caterpillars, like the butterfly caterpillars, hide away during the day and only come out at night, but there are some which you can find. This is a fairly late stage emperor moth, quite impressive, just like the adult. The pale tussock we saw earlier, often feeding on fruit tree leaves. The elephant hawk moth, which when it's full grown, it sits around during the day, often on rosebay willow herb stems. This is in late summer. And when they're looking for somewhere to pupate, they will often wander around on the ground. And every year there's a newspaper article published somewhere saying how someone's found a 3-inch long snake in their garden. And of course, it's an elephant hawk moth. Then there's some just very interestingly shaped moths, like the poplar kitten here. That's not a sting, but clearly it's meant to suggest to predators that it might be a sting, and they can spray out noxious liquid from there. And then the mullein moth, which again rests openly in the day on your mulleins, verbascums, sometimes will eat buddleia as well. They grow pretty big and pretty obvious when you see them, very easy to find. So another way that you can find things during the day is through a thing called leaf mines. Now, there's a whole load of moths, probably several hundred species, which they're all tiny moths, and they all have caterpillars which are thin enough to feed between the upper and lower layers of a leaf. And they form these mines where they actually travel around inside the leaf, eating the insides of the leaf. Often the eggs laid at one end of the mine, the narrow end, and at the top end, when they're finished feeding, they will actually form their pupa or their chrysalis on the leaf. If you look at a bramble or a blackberry, I doubt if there's one bramble patch in the whole of this country which does not have several mines of Stigmella aurella on it. You can find the mines at pretty well any time of the year. Then this is one called Philonicta platani, which forms a different kind of mine. It forms a blotch mine on the underside of London plains. Obviously in our area we've got plenty of London plains, and if you look at the leaves, especially later in the year, late summer and autumn, you'll find these what look like pieces of tissue paper stuck to the leaf. And then there's a small group called Philonictis, and this is Philonictis unipunctella, which form what are called snail trails. So it looks like a snail has been running all over the leaf quite wildly, almost on hallucinogenics, the route it follows. And these are found mainly on species of poplar and willow. And they're all very easy to find. And you can see that the moths that come from them are all quite small. I mean, some of them are quite nicely patterned, but they tend to be the kind of moths that you need a hand lens to look at. And it's much easier to find their leaf mines than it ever is the adults. There are actually, as I say, several hundred of these, and there is a site on the web about leaf mines. Some of them are very easy because they're restricted to one species of tree or plant. Some are rather more Catholic in their tastes and can be a bit harder to distinguish. But it's always worth looking for leaf mines, particularly mid-September up to leaf fall. And then there are things called cases. Now, some moths, I don't know, this is playing a bit of video. I hope everyone can actually see the video running. But anyway, this is a moth whose caterpillar lives in a case made of debris that it picks up and sticks to itself like a caddisfly, and then crawls across the surface of the bark like this. Oops. And that's called Diplodoma Angela, rather. Very strange creature indeed. And then we have different kinds of cases. This is on oregano, and the caterpillar actually lives more or less standing on its head in this case made from chewed up bits of the leaf, and actually feeds around the base. You can see it moves around, and after a while it will move, and sometimes you can find a leaf with several of these scars on it, and that is Coleophora albitarcella. And these mines, if you look often on the underside, sometimes on the upper side of leaves, are quite obvious because they look so odd, and they can be up to a centimetre long. So they're not micro type things. Though the moths are very micro, as you can see. That's actually a different species of Coleophora coccinella, because I haven't got a good picture of albitarcella. And that's a case this is very common. You often see this attached to leaves or fences or walls, where the moth caterpillar forms a little case made of strips of dead grass attached to itself, and then crawls about again, tail up in the air, and that's Psyche castor, and that's what the adult looks like. That's what the male looks like. The female can't fly, and in fact she spends virtually her whole life in the case. The male finds her and mates with her while she's in the case, and then she lays her eggs, and that's it. You often find these cases stuck all over the place. And then this is another little case you can find. This is made out of lichen, and this is on a tree. You often find them on gravestones. If you look in churchyards, they're quite easy to find. And that's Luffia Furchild, I can't say it, Furchild teller. So again, these are all things you can look for in the daytime. Now, pheromones. There are a whole group of day-flying moths called clearwings, and we can use pheromones now, which are little plastic bungs impregnated with an artificial pheromone, and they will attract the moth. These are day-flying moths, much more easily. You'll never see them otherwise. These are actually emperor moths on Furfield Heath flying around their lawn, so it's not all clearwings. And they think there's a female here. I mean, they're going to be sorely disappointed when they try and mate with a plastic bung in a bit of net curtain. But you can see, even on a dull, windy day, there's about 4 or 5 of them flying around this lure. And this is the orange-tailed clearwing. And you just hang these up in the garden or somewhere, and usually within a few minutes, if the moth is around, it will come and fly around, you know, and be attracted. It's a very raw. These clearwings are available from a company called Anglian Lepidoptera Supply, so I highly recommend for all sorts of equipment. They actually cost about £5 each, but you can keep them. You have to keep them in the freezer until you're going to use them. A bit like COVID-19 vaccines, but they actually last for 3 or 4 years. So when you spread that out over a period of time, they're not that expensive, but a very rewarding way of finding moths, which are highly unlikely to see during the day. And these are just some still photos of some of these species of moth, just to show you what they actually look like. The clear wings and the hornet moth, which is also a clear wing, quite clearly mimics of wasps and hornets, as the name suggests, and very good mimics of them, some of them. And then again, we've got the emperor moth, just another picture. So moths can be attracted to light, and I hope this is one that will appeal particularly to Brian, because this is a wall, part of the wall of the John F. Kennedy Memorial Library in Boston, Massachusetts, which faces out over the bay, and there's a huge wall which is floodlit at night and some windows next to it. And we went there a couple of years ago, and it's actually covered in moths. It's not very easy to capture how many moths there were. That's just an example of Zala lunata, which is an American moth. You won't find that in this country. But if you've got somewhere where there's a lot of public lighting or flood lighting, it's worth going along early in the morning, hopefully before you beat the birds, to see what's been attracted. And railway stations are a good place to find moths because they're often lit well into the night. So that was a large tabby moth at Hertford North Station. These large yellow underwings were attracted to our kitchen light on the window of the kitchen, and form quite a good picture of what moths look like when they're mating. And then we've got a common marble carpet, again at a station, look in the waiting room, the booking office and so on. Another good place for looking for moths like that is if you've got public toilets which are lit up at night. A visit to the public toilet in the morning can sometimes be quite rewarding, though you might get some funny looks, of course. And if you start getting your camera out to photograph any of it, you'll certainly get some funny looks.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So let's go on to what many people think of as moth recording, which is light trapping. This is where you have a bright light run at night, and you attract moths generally into a box. So there's several different forms, as we'll see. They're all basically a box with a bright light on top, and something that when the moths are attracted to that light, they hit a baffle and go into the bottom and then rest in the egg boxes until the morning. Then you can go and examine and find out what you've got. So this is what's called a Robinson trap, which is the sort of deluxe, the biggest and most expensive kind of trap. Then we have a Skinner trap, thanks to Liz for a photo of hers. And this has what's called actinic or fluorescent tubes in, which all these lights give out more ultraviolet light than an ordinary lamp, an ordinary bulb would do. And they work on the same principle. The third kind of common trap is a Heath trap, which again running with the actinic tubes. These are more portable, but it's all the same principle: a box and a light, basically, and something inside to hold the moths. And then sometimes you'll see, if you go to a public show demonstration or something of moth trapping, you'll see the mercury vapor bulb just run in front of sheets. So this is one that I actually run at a church near me, at Waterford Church, and you can see from the close-up of the sheet how many things are attracted, many of which aren't moths. There are some moths on there, but there's also beetles, flies, wasps, caddis flies, all sorts of things turn up. But you can see you can get quite a dense agglomeration of insects. And another way, and I haven't got pictures of me doing this, so this is nicked off our very own butterfly conservation website, is providing food for moths. A few moths are not very good at coming to light, but will actually visit sources of food, basically sticky, sweet, and alcoholic. So you can understand why they might be attracted. The sugaring, which is what the chap's doing down there, is painting the sugar mixture. The recipe's up the top there. And then wine ropes, which can be very messy, where you basically make up a mixture, dip rope into it, and then hang it from various plants. So it's a pretty messy process. And you'll find certain species, particularly things like the old lady and the red underwing, which are not heavily attracted to light, will come and feed. And the alcohol has the twin attractions. A, the smell attracts them, and B, it tends to slow them down a bit as well, but makes it good for looking at them. And that's something you can easily concoct in your own kitchen if you wish. And that particularly works well late summer, early autumn. So that's a recording. So I'm just going to go through a sort of a potluck of various things now to do with some of the moths in our area. So declining species, these were once all quite common and are now very rare in our area. So we've got the garden dart, the scarce tissue, which despite its name was more common than it is now, the garden tiger, which was a very familiar moth in people's gardens up until about 20 years ago in our area. Still occasionally found, but it's basically retreated north and west, as probably to do with warming. The lackey, which just seems to have declined. You can still get the occasional ones. Some, like the spotted sulphur, which is the Breckland moth. I think there's only ever one record in Hertfordshire Middlesex. Is now pretty well extinct in the whole country. And the V moth, which, considering it feeds on blackberries and red currants and gooseberries and things like that, is now an extremely rare moth, certainly highly threatened across much of Britain. That's the only example I've ever caught in my entire life. But we have expanding species as well. So down here, we've got a couple of members of the wainscot family. The white point, very excited when I first got this in my garden about 5 years ago. I think last year I caught about 170 of them. And next to it is the L. album wainscot, again, not found anywhere near Hertfordshire or Middlesex until 2 or 3 years ago, and now turning up in lots of people's gardens. And I was lucky enough to get 3 in one night of that. Tree lichen beauty was considered a migrant moth just on the south coast until a few years ago. Now very well distributed and quite variable. You can see in pattern and form. And then 2 that have recently occurred in Hertfordshire, the oak rustic and the black spotted chestnut. Still not widespread. I think the oak rustic, there's a couple of Hertfordshire records. I think me and Liz have had them in Hertford and Ware. And the black spotted chestnut, again, found in Hertford and Ware, and not many other places in Hertfordshire, but probably expanding across the county, albeit slowly. Toadflax brocade, you used to have to go down to Dungeness to see that on the gravel, the coastal gravel and so on. But over the last 10 years, that's spread across much of southeastern England, now well established. Scarlet tiger, fairly common to the west of Hertfordshire, but now turning up in more and more places in Hertfordshire. Again, seems to be moved from west to east for this very, very attractive moth. And then again, I thought I'd put the Jersey tiger in again. We've seen that's the yellow form, which probably constitutes about 20 or 30% of the population compared to the ones with red underwings. But they are all certainly expanding across our area. Quick look at some household species, for better or for worse. Many of you will be familiar with clothes moths, and the case-bearing clothes moth is probably the commonest example. Its caterpillars form a case at the clothes that it eats, as you can see at the bottom there, and that's the adult, which doesn't move very much. Occasionally found outside, as that one was. They don't cause any problems, but it's the caterpillars that hatch from their eggs which cause the problems with clothes. The Indian meal moth, which doesn't eat your curry or anything, or poppadoms or anything like that, but is a pest of stored food, and very easy to find in pet shops that sell loose pet food, and hence the name Indian meal, because it's a North American species. Indian meal equals maize because it's pet stored maize. And then two house moths, which don't really damage anything, are quite often found in houses and can be found outside, which their caterpillars will eat any old detritus, hair, dust, breadcrumbs, anything like that. They're both very common moths. I'd be surprised if most of you haven't got those in your house at some point. And then we have thought of putting a few problem species. Excuse me. Horse chestnut leaf miner, which you have all, I'm sure, have seen. Horse chestnuts, which towards the end of the summer look as if they're in autumn, they're about to shed all their leaves. And this is a moth that's spread across the whole of Europe over about 10 years, from Croatia, I think it was. It's quite an attractive little moth. And if you go at the right time and look at any horse chestnut pretty well, you might see things flying around which look like a swarm of midges. And there's a very good chance they'll actually be the horse chestnut leaf miner. And if you look on the trunk, you can often see hundreds of them crawling around on the trunk. And it's quite an attractive little moth, but it's almost hand lens size. Then another one that's had a lot of publicity is the oak processionary moth, which was introduced into this country when a developer thought it would be a better idea to introduce import fairly mature Italian oak trees to a new housing development in southwest London rather than growing native trees. Unfortunately, our biosecurity wasn't terribly good, and it brought in the eggs of the oak processionary moth. These live in big groups and have these long hairs, which can be very irritant if they get blown in the wind into people's eyes, particularly affect pets like dogs and so on. And they're called processionary moths because they will walk about in a long line. In fact, people have done experiments where if you take some and form them into a circle, they'll just walk round and round and round in circles until they starve to death. But it's not something I'd recommend trying to do. And that's the adult. They're becoming more and more common. There are attempts to control them, but I think it's gone beyond that now. Box tree moth I already mentioned. I'm sure very familiar. It comes in two forms, the common one with the white with brown edges, and a less common form, which is all over brown, more or less, both quite translucent. The good thing is, unlike a lot of these introduced moths, our British native birds will eat them, and there's a house sparrow with a box tree moth in its beak. And the gypsy moth, which is probably more of a problem in North America than it is in this country, but it's a moth which became extinct in this country about 100 years ago, but is now spread back in, again, warming of the climate. The male on the left there, and the female on an egg mass on the right. She's much bigger than the male, can't fly very well, if at all. And they are very good at defoliating trees. So expect to see these much more than you do now. Okay, let's have a look at some migrants that come in. These are some migrant hawks. This is the death's head hawk moth caterpillar. I hope the video is working all right. At least if it isn't, you can see it. That's one colour form of it, which is a sort of a army disguise colour.
Yeah, that's great. It seems to be working fine.
Oh, brilliant, good. And it is about to do something. Oh, anyway, and that's the other colour form. So caterpillars can have different colour forms as well. These were actually found in someone's garden in Radlett. They were living on jasmine, and the first thing they noticed was on their patio, lots of these cubic black lumps, which they actually they actually create cubic frass, which is basically cubic pew, which must be, you think how they managed to pass that. But and then they looked up, poked around in the jasmine growing on the pergola, and found these big caterpillars. So this is a rare migrant into this country. The adult obviously very familiar from things like the book whose name has escaped me, but I'm sure you know what I mean. And then we have an increased common moth, the hummingbird hawk moth, which again comes in. That's what they look like below, and this is one actually feeding on some valerian and behaving in that characteristic hummingbird-like form, not actually landing on the host, but dipping its long proboscis into each flower as it goes round. And just another one, which is a striped hawk moth. So there's a whole load of these hawk moths, which are migrants, and there are other moths which are migrant as well that come into the country. People get very excited about them. Most of them are not common. It's always quite an excitement if you do catch one of these. And then we've got aquatic moths. Who would have believed it? So there's pretty obviously an aquatic environment. The water veneer, which most of these spend their whole life in a pond, apart from the adults, which will fly a short way away. The water veneer will actually swarm on warm, hot, humid nights some way away from ponds. So we've got the beautiful China mark, we've got the brown China mark, we've got the small China mark, and the ring China mark. And all of these spend virtually their whole life feeding on pondweed and floating around as caterpillars and pupae in ponds. And then we've got a few moths which go for 3D effects. We've got the lilac beauty trying to be a bunch of leaves. You can see how the wings are folded and crinkled. And the purple thorn, which rests like this with its wings sort of 3/4 open. Then we've got crested moths like the golden plusia. And we've got lumpy moths like the angle shades, again pretending to be a piece of wood. And then some micros. We've got a whole group of moths which have these huge rhinoceros type horns, which are called palps. And that's just one particular species. You've got some moths, this is another micro, which have these big hair tufts on the wings. And you have the yellowtail, which normally keeps its tail right down there. If you poke it or disturb it, it arches its tail right up above its wings to expose its brightly coloured golden tail. So moths operate in 3D perhaps much more than butterflies do. And then we have moths which disguise themselves. This is the merveille du jour, which flies in October and November and looks like a patch of lichen. Light brocade, which again another bark imitator. Autumn flying moths, the sallows, quite clearly imitating autumn leaves. Mullein moth, we saw its caterpillar, which stands out. The adult looks again like a load of twigs. Caterpillars also do it. This is a pale brindle beauty caterpillar. This is one of a big group of geometers whose moths look like broken twigs. And then the lime speck pug, one again of quite a number of moths which look like bird droppings or just general white markings on trees and so on. And then hopefully a little bit of relaxing slow-mo video. These males actually leck, we call it lecking, gather together and fly up and down, and a bit faster this, but I like them slowed down, to attract females. They're day-flying moths, they're longhorn moths, as you can probably see. And they do this dance in the late spring, often around trees, and they're not a rare moth, but they are rather wonderful to see. And down the bottom there is details of who actually deals with our moth records. And thank you very much for watching and listening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And there's just another selection uncaptioned of some more Hertfordshire moths, which I will identify for you as they haven't got captions on. Top left is the Chinese character, which is a bird dropping imitator, the waved black, the ruby tiger. Then down the right hand side, we've got the leopard moth, we've got the sallow kitten, and we've got the cream bordered green pea. And in the middle, we've got one of the most spectacular but reasonably common moths, the eyed hawk moth. So once again, thank you. I hope you enjoyed that.
Great. Well, thanks, Andrew. That's a really fascinating talk, and amazing how many different moths there are. Who would have believed it? Now, I don't know if we can take down the screen sharing. Good. Oh yeah, there it's come through now. So I'm I'm going to throw it open to any questions. I'm not seeing any questions yet in the chat, but if anyone would like to ask a question, then maybe you can unmute yourself and fire away.
Best software for maintaining your records.
Sorry, Dick. I think you got cut off just at the start there. Could you?
Yeah. What's the best software? What do you keep your record on? Is it the special UK Moth Group's Excel spreadsheet, centrally recorded? What do people do?
Okay. The full database is kept on a thing called MapMate, which you can download. And I know quite a few people do use that for recording all sorts of groups of species. I find it a little bit awkward to deal with, but I know a lot of people do use it. That's a program you have to subscribe. It's about £12 a year, I think, for access to it. You download it onto your PC. It's not really phone based. It's quite ancient software now, based on Microsoft Access. I personally keep my records in a spreadsheet, and then I've got a little method which enables them to be easily pulled together fairly quickly into the right format for Colin Plant to load it into MapMate. But I know, I mean, here's the moth recorder, but and he will deal with records set, back of an envelope. He'll deal with the records like that. But obviously, the more they're kept in a somewhat more formal format, the easier it is. And I think someone had asked in the thing about, Sue Taylor had asked, do we take records off iRecord? Yeah, a lot of moth records are put on there. I know because of difficulties sometimes in identifying things clearly, a lot of moth recorders are probably slightly more skeptical about using things from iRecord than perhaps some of us butterfly recorders are, where the number of species is somewhat smaller. But I think they will begin to be taken off there. But you're better sending things direct to Colin than actually putting them on iRecord if you want them to get on the database, to be perfectly frank at the moment. So yeah, that's the ways of recording moths.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. I think Karina Smart, you had a question as well. Do you want to unmute and ask it?
I do apologise for the lack of video. My PC is very strange.
Oh no, that's okay.
It's not because I'm trying to be smarto, as it were. Thank you, Andrew. That was absolutely fascinating. I've had a moth trap for, I think, since 2018 when I went to Bird Fair. And I have a couple of friends who help me with ID, but I find ID really difficult. But I'd just like to know which of the, kind of online groups would be best for me to share that with? Is it the local group or UK Moths? I'm a very good birder. I'm okay with butterflies, ID. Moths are whole other world.
Yeah, I agree. It is a steep learning curve compared to butterflies. I think my recommendation would be, if you, I assume you're in, I'm sorry, I don't know where you live, Karina, but if you're in Hertfordshire or Middlesex, I would join the Facebook group for.
Sorry, just to interrupt you, Andrew, I'm Isleworth, so I'm kind of very urban Middlesex.
That's absolutely fine. If you join the Herts and Middlesex Moth Group Facebook site, there are several people on there who are very quick at giving IDs from photographs. I mean, obviously, if it's something that can't be ID'd from a photograph, they will say so. But it's quite a friendly group, and a lot of people do post up pictures, and that's probably a good place to start, especially as, you know, if they're moths which are likely to be seen in our area, then you've got the people who are the experts on our particular area. And you know, there are other identification groups for micro moths, for macro moths, for caterpillars, which are much more national. But I would start local if I were you, and you'll get to recognise some of the names. You may find there are other people near you who are trapping. I know there are quite a few people who do trap in southwest Middlesex. So that's where I would go. So, you know, if you get a few photos, stick them up on that Facebook site, and I think the chances are you'll soon get some IDs.
Thank you, Andrew. I am actually trying to work some macro photography into it because I'm trying to learn my photography as well. But if in kind of problems, I just take it from the phone. So thank you. That's really helpful, and it's been a brilliant presentation. So thank you so much tonight.
Okay, thank you.
Right, Dick Ashford, I think you had a question.
I've muted myself. When are you going to start running your trap?
I never stop. Runs every night of the year when I'm at home.
Wow.
Has done since 2002.
Oh, right.
So there's something flying every well, not every night here. All through the year, there are moths which only fly in December and January and February. Not many, admittedly. And if you're in a suburban garden like me, you might go 20 days without catching anything. If you've got some woodland or scrubland near your garden, then this time of the year, you'll find a remarkable number of moths can be attracted. There's someone who lives near me in the same suburb as me, but has woodland at the back of his garden. And on a mild night in January, he can attract over 100 moths.
Well, Nick Bowles had asked what moths are flying tonight, but I was just going to ask you, but if it's 100, maybe that's a bit of a long answer.
Nick, are you talking about the groups and about what's flying tonight?
Yeah, I meant the online groups. I didn't mean not the online groups. It's a website, isn't it, which gives you a list.
That's right. Yeah, I thought that's what you meant. I could have gone through lots of moth. I mean, there are lots of these different groups. And yeah, I don't use them personally, but yeah, they're perfectly all right. And I just couldn't fit everything. I wanted to be fairly concise.
Sorry, I mentioned it because Corrine was saying she has trouble, and it tells you in order of what's been caught in Hertfordshire, if you live in Hertfordshire as she does, or Middlesex. It tells you what's been seen local to you, with the most likely thing you will see that night first, and then in decreasing likelihood of you seeing them. So it's really helpful for working out. I'm very poor at moths, but I find it really helpful because if I think I've seen something, I can look at that, and if it's in the top 10, I think, well, maybe it is. And if it's in the last 10, I think it isn't.
No, that's fine. I mean, yeah, there are lots of groups, and I mean, I see Liz has just mentioned the Norfolk moth group. There are lots of other moth groups which have websites which are probably far more whizzy than ours. There's Norfolk, there's Suffolk, and there's various other ones which I can't think of that have a lot of pictures and information. So yeah, take your pick. I mean, go on to, just have a look around the web, just do a search engine search, and you'll find all sorts of things. I wasn't meaning my list to be exclusive by any means, really just concentrating on our local sites and what I consider to be the the reference work online. But yeah, thanks for contributing those.
Are there any more questions before we say thank you to Andrew?
Brian has one. Brian's putting his hand up. Or was?
My dogs have decided to start barking again. It was a very excellent talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I have been asked as a naturalist in the last 40 years many questions, but the most common question asked in 40 years is what's the difference between butterflies and moths? And we have the same answer, which makes me feel very good.
Oh,
When are we going to get around in North America, you don't know the answer, but in England, to common names for micro moths?
right. Oh yes, I was hoping someone.
Because even you tripped over a few of them.
I did, yes. They're not ones that I use in everyday conversation, I must admit. Now, there is someone, about 3 years ago, actually sat down and created a common name for every British micro moth. And most of them are appalling, in my opinion. There can be three or four words. Oh, yes, there we go. Micro moth vernacular names. I don't like them. Most moth recorders don't like them because, to be honest, a lot of them don't trip off the tongue that much more quickly than the scientific name. I mean, I can say the scientific names, things that I find fairly regularly, but yeah, things that I don't. I mean, some of those moths that I've shown you there are not ones that I find day in, day out. And you'll find that many people don't use these. Well, I mean, all English names are artificially created. Quite well, scientific names are artificially created as well, and unfortunately, scientific names do change, just like English names can change. So someone has done it, but I think there's a lot of resistance to using them because if you've got used to the scientific names, you don't really want to have to learn a new language, a new form of English. But I suspect that people who are beginning to trap, or the youngsters, that sort of thing, they may start using them more often. You do see them referred to. And I think the Norfolk, Liz has got that book as well. I don't have that book, which may tell you something about my attitude to micro moth vernacular names.
Okay.
So yeah, there we go.
Fair enough.
Okay, good question there.
Right, I think we've got time for one last question if anyone else has got one, or we'll move on to Brian's book.
One quick question, if I may.
Yeah, go fire ahead.
What time do moths fly? I mean, generally they fly at night, but will they fly predominantly after dusk or throughout the night? I'm just wondering about, most trapping is done overnight, then you look at the results in the morning. But is it valid to go out at dusk for a couple of hours with a trap, pot any specimens, go home before and get a decent night's sleep at home?
Yeah.
And then,
right.
Is that valid?
Yeah, that's valid. There are moths that fly at dusk. There are moths that fly through most of the night. There are moths that don't start flying till 1 o'clock in the morning. Sometimes the books say something doesn't fly at a particular time, and then you'll catch it. I usually find if I put the lights on as it's getting dark, you won't attract much to begin with. You tend to attract caddisflies and things like that. And then the swift moths will turn up fairly early in some of the geometers like green carpets. And then once you get to about, and this is in high summer, once you get to about 11 o'clock, you'll get a whole flood of moths coming in. So when it's really dark, and then come 1 o'clock, there'll be another group of moths come in. And so there's the whole thing all through the night, really. Some moths don't fly till 8, some fly all through the night. But certainly one of the techniques of recording moths, which I didn't mention, which pertains to what you were saying, is a thing called dusking, where you go out with a net just as it's getting dark and sweep through long grass with a net, because a lot of moths are active but don't tend to be necessarily that strongly attracted to light, or are just waking up, if you like, and can be disturbed very easily and put in a net. And then obviously you can put them in a pot and see what they are. So yeah, recording at dusk is very valid.
Okay,
Great.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Andrew. It was really interesting. We've had some lovely comments come in the chat box. I'm going to do a poll in a minute, just to give you a chance to give some feedback, and for the benefit of our market research team. But just before I do that, I wanted to just come back to Brian's book, which he mentioned at the start. I'm going to try and share a picture of it on the screen. I've got stuck on an email, so it's not particularly good. But it's by the book's by Hugh Newman on British moths and their haunts. It's an old book. I wouldn't like to guess how long ago it was written, but probably back in the 1960s from the look of it.
48, I think.
48. Okay. I mean, it was a classic of its time, and it has a lot of useful information on. And Brian has said he'd very kindly he'll post it to anyone that would like a copy of the book. It's subject to getting a donation to Butterfly Conservation. So Brian, do you want to?
Yeah, I'll throw in a copy of this. By your friend Brian Cassie.
Aha, your very own book. Excellent.
Yeah, I'll throw it in.
Okay. So I guess it's a question of would anyone like to suggest a donation or put their hand up to give a donation to Butterfly Conservation in return for a book? Perhaps the easiest way to do it would be to put something in the chat room.
Yes. Fine.
I'll while you're having a think about that, perhaps we'll go on and do the poll. I've got a let me see. We got that. Oh. I need to go to polls. Right. I've got a few questions I want you to answer. They're fairly simple, and don't think about them for too long. But there's 3 questions altogether, so I'll launch it up now, and it should come up on your screen, give you a chance to answer them. Hold on. Can anybody see the questions?
Yep, I can.
Hopefully. All right, there should be 3 altogether. So scroll down if you're struggling to see them all on the screen. Well, it's quite exciting. I can see the votes all coming in real time with little bars going up and down. So I think pretty much everyone's voted now. So I'm going to end the polling, and then share the results. Fingers crossed. So hopefully the market research team are taking notes here, Liz. Can you see the results? Hopefully. Well, it's saying that most people are members of the branch, and what's the answer to the second one? Is most people got to know the meeting through the branch email that went out, which was our main way of publicising it, and 100% enjoyed the talk a lot. So that is a very successful. But I think we got up to 63 people, Andrew. So before you get too big-headed, there were a few that left before the end. But that was
urgent business elsewhere.
Well, it was a great talk. Thank you very much. It was really, really good to hear that. Okay, so let's stop the sharing. And oh, we've got some more in the chat box. Have we got any bids for the book? That's the main thing.
Yeah, I got the book.
We can change the title if you don't have any bids yet.
No, Malcolm, I've sent you a private message, but I think you need to suggest an appropriate donation, because I want the child's book as well as the old book.
Oh, fine, Richard. They'll come to you.
Okay. Well, I'll negotiate with Malcolm and as to what he thinks is reasonable, because I don't want to be too mean.
No.
Well, I think.
May I apologise? Sorry, Malcolm. May I apologise? I had to pop out just during that part about the book, and I completely missed it. So I just wondered what it was all about. Sorry.
What's it all about? Well, it's all about moths. Brian's donating a book, and we've asked. He's planning to send it to someone in return for a donation, and it was a question of whether anyone wanted the book and if they were going to suggest a donation. Maybe we should, Brian, think about maybe if it's easy if people if we give some sort of idea of what it's worth. But I think when I looked it up on beforehand, it was about I thought it was about £10. But
yeah, something like that.
Fine.
I don't know what's about this. What's about the other book, Brian?
No. Okay. So I have on the shelf here some of Debrera's Butterflies of the World. You know, big books that weigh 15 pounds, and I think they would cost me $50 to send them to you. I would be happy to give them, but I started off with a skinny book. So I just want to see how much it cost to me. The next book I was thinking of is Love Among the Butterflies.
Oh, that's good.
And it's by Margaret Fontaine, and it's a wonderful book.
Well, look, send us a photo of that, and we'll put it up for next.
I will for the next talk.
Yeah,
I'll be there.
Okay.
All right, and you send me the information of where this is going to Richard.
Yeah.
And,
okay. Well, look.
You answer at the meeting, Malcolm. I think that's the easiest way.
Okay. Yeah. All right. You do that. I'll give you the donation information, and then we'll sort it out. Great.
And just to Malcolm, just to remind everyone, I think we've got the next talk is 2 weeks' time. And we have Sharon talking to us. Sharon's our regional officer, and she'd be talking about it's going to be a more regional based evening.
You took the words out of my mouth, Liz.
Oh, right, okay.
I was just putting the details of the programme up so you can see the next talk. We will be sending an email around to all branch members with the link on, but it will also be on our website if people want to look that. And then the following talk on the 3rd of March is by Roger Gibbons, which is going to be on identifying lookalike butterfly species. So something to get your eye in for the new season. I think that's really all, unless there's anything else anyone wanted to say. That's probably...
May I just say thank you very much indeed. This is my very first meeting tonight and online one, and I've been a member of the Butterfly Conservation for a long time, and you have been just fantastic about sending me information locally. But I just want to thank every single person who has been involved in all the organisation. I'm somebody who is very involved in lots of different organisations, and
Oh, I think we've lost you.
single one of you who's involved for all this, and it's fabulous because we're so we are all absolutely there with saving our butterflies, our moths, and all the other that we have around us. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for coming. I mean, we had no idea how many people we were expecting, but 63 is a jolly good attendance, and we're very pleased with that. So many thanks to Andrew, and thanks to all of you that have stuck on to the end, and we'll hopefully see some of you again in 2 weeks' time.
Thank
Cool.
you.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good night.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
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 Yes,
Bye.
very enjoyable. Thank you.
That was absolutely great. Great.
That was a big sigh.